History loves clean stories. A crown passes, a king falls, a successor rises. Hollywood especially loves that version. Because in movies, power is poetic. It transfers in slow motion, accompanied by music, last words, and destiny. The torch is handed over gently, like a sacred object meant for only one chosen soul. But the streets of Harlem never worked that way. And the most famous transfer of power in American crime history may be the biggest lie ever sold. If you've seen American Gangster, you already know the scene. Harlem is sweating under the weight of history. The civil rights movement is roaring. The streets are tense. Change is in the air, and so is blood. Inside a department store, an old man walks slowly, his era coming to an end. Elsworth Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed godfather of Harlem, clutches his chest. He stumbles. He collapses. And there, perfectly positioned, is Frank Lucas. His protege, his right hand, his heir. Bumpy dies in Frank's arms. The camera lingers. The meaning is clear. The crown has been passed. The student has become the master. Frank Lucas steps over the body of his mentor and into history as the new king of Harlem. It is cinematic perfection. There's only one problem. None of it happened. Not the location. Not the relationship. Not the moment. Not the blessing. According to the people who actually lived that life, the ones who didn't need a screenplay, that scene is pure fiction. A fantasy polished by Hollywood lights and sold to the world as truth. And that lie didn't just rewrite history. It made a legend. For more than 40 years, Frank Lucas told the same story. He told journalists. He told authors. He told prosecutors. He told Hollywood. He said he was Bumpy Johnson's shadow, his student, his confidant, the man who sat beside him while Harlem was carved up like a chessboard. He claimed Bumpy trusted him more than anyone, that he was there when decisions were made, that when Bumpy grew tired, Frank was already running the show. And most importantly, Frank said this: when Bumpy Johnson died, he chose him. The world believed it. Why wouldn't they? Bumpy Johnson was dead. The grave doesn't argue, and Frank Lucas spoke with confidence, the kind that sounds like truth if no one is left alive to contradict it. But Frank Lucas made one critical mistake. Bumpy Johnson did not leave Harlem alone. He left behind someone far more dangerous than any rival gangster. He left behind his wife. Her name was Mayme Johnson, and she was not a woman you lied about casually. In Harlem, people called her the First Lady, the Queen, the keeper of the real ledger. She knew every alliance, every betrayal, every favor owed, and every body buried. While men bragged in bars, Mayme listened from living rooms. While legends were created in public, truth lived quietly in her memory. For decades, she said nothing. She watched Frank Lucas build an empire not just with heroin, but with stories. She watched him turn interviews into mythology. She watched him collect checks, applause, and credibility, all built on her husband's name. She stayed silent through it all, until Hollywood crossed a line. When American Gangster hit theaters, Mayme Johnson watched a man she knew to be a driver portrayed as a prince. She watched a fictional death scene erase the man who actually held Bumpy as he died. She watched her husband's legacy handed to someone Bumpy had never respected as an equal. And that's when the silence ended. She didn't shout. She didn't sue. She didn't threaten. She did something far colder. She told the truth. And with 4 simple words, she destroyed a myth that took decades to build. To understand why her words mattered, you need to understand Harlem as it really was, not the version sold on movie posters. Harlem in the 1940s and 50s was not chaos. It was order. Brutal, unforgiving order governed by strict rules. You didn't become powerful because you wanted to, you earned it, slowly, violently, publicly. And Bumpy Johnson had earned every inch of his throne. He fought the Jewish mobs. He negotiated with the Italian families. He survived betrayals, prison, and Alcatraz itself. This was a man who read Shakespeare and Nietzsche in solitary confinement. A man who quoted poetry while ordering executions. A strategist who viewed Harlem like a chessboard, every move calculated, every piece expendable. Power to Bumpy wasn't loud, it was precise. Frank Lucas was none of that. When Frank arrived in Harlem in 1946, he wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't even important. He was a poor, hungry young man fleeing the Jim Crow South, a fourth-grade dropout from North Carolina with nothing but ambition and teeth clenched tight enough to survive. Frank didn't arrive with a plan. He arrived with desperation. He mugged drunks, he ran street hustles, he scraped money from anywhere he could find it. He lived on the edges of the underworld, not at its center. He wasn't building an empire. He was trying not to starve. The legend says Bumpy Johnson noticed Frank's boldness and took him under his wing. The street version is far less romantic. Bumpy didn't need a partner. He needed a driver. He needed someone to watch the car, someone to stand outside in the cold while the real business happened behind closed doors, someone expendable, someone useful, someone silent. In organized crime, this distinction matters. A lieutenant sits at the table. An associate stands by the door. A lieutenant knows the numbers, the police, the politics. An associate opens doors, holds coats, keeps engines running. Frank Lucas was an associate. And Mayme Johnson never forgot that. She would later say Frank was always around, the way a shadow is around, present, but never in control. He drove Bumpy to meetings with Italian families. He waited while men like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello negotiated Harlem's future. Frank wasn't part of those conversations. He guarded them. He saw power up close, but he never touched it. Later, Frank would claim Bumpy taught him everything: heroin routes, international supply chains, smuggling secrets. That version collapses under scrutiny. Bumpy Johnson was not a heroin kingpin in the way Frank described. He was a numbers man, a protector, a tax collector. He tolerated heroin because he couldn't eliminate it and because the Italians demanded their cut. But he despised what drugs were doing to Harlem. Bumpy did not love the trade. He did not romanticize it. And he certainly wasn't mentoring a driver on how to flood his own neighborhood with poison. Frank, however, was watching. He watched how Bumpy commanded rooms without raising his voice. He watched how respect followed him into restaurants. He watched the tailored suits, the quiet authority, the way people lowered their eyes. And Frank decided something. One day, he wouldn't be the man holding the door. He would be the man everyone waited for. Here's where Frank's story begins to unravel completely. He claimed he spent 15 years at Bumpy's side, learning the game. But history introduces a problem no lie can survive. In 1952, Bumpy Johnson was sentenced to 15 years in Alcatraz. For 11 of those years, he was locked inside a concrete box, surrounded by ocean and guards, 3,000 miles away from Harlem. 11 years. During that time, Frank Lucas was not running an empire. He was not keeping the throne warm. Harlem didn't pause waiting for him. The real power stayed with Bumpy's true lieutenants, men with scars, reputations, and blood debts. Names Frank never mentioned because they contradicted his story. Frank stayed on the fringes, hustling, gambling, moving small amounts of product. A nobody. When Bumpy finally returned in 1963, Harlem was different, more dangerous, more crowded. The Italians were tighter, the police smarter. Heroin was no longer a problem, it was a tidal wave. Bumpy was older, his body was failing. And Frank was still there. Loyal, useful, hungry. This is where the grain of truth lives inside the lie. Frank Lucas was loyal. He was ambitious. And he was waiting. By the mid-1960s, tension was growing. Bumpy believed power came from the community, feeding families, paying rent, keeping order. Frank believed power came from fear and money alone. Pure profit. No loyalty, no restraint. Mayme Johnson watched this dynamic unfold from her living room. She saw Frank nod enthusiastically while his eyes scanned the apartment, calculating value. She didn't see a son seeking a father. She saw a thief studying a blueprint. And as Bumpy's health declined, Frank's patience did too. He started talking louder, dressing louder, acting like a successor without permission. The streets noticed. And Bumpy noticed too. One night at a dinner meant for serious men, Frank arrived dressed like a walking headline, jewelry flashing, voice booming. trying to impress Italians who valued silence over swagger. Bumpy didn't yell. He didn't strike him. He simply stared, then leaned over and whispered something that drained all the confidence from Frank's face. Frank sat down. He shut up, and the message was clear. You are not the king. Frank swallowed the humiliation. But he didn't forget it, because time was on his side, and the lion was dying. Every empire has a moment of weakness. Not the moment it collapses, the moment before that. The quiet pause when everyone feels it coming, but no one says it out loud. By 1968, Harlem was holding its breath. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was still the name that opened doors, but the body behind that name was failing. His heart was tired. His hands trembled when he held the newspaper. The years in Alcatraz had carved something permanent into him, not fear but exhaustion. He had outlived enemies who wanted him dead. He had outlived partners who betrayed him. He had outlived entire eras. But he could not outlive time. And Frank Lucas knew it. Bumpy's days had slowed. Mornings were no longer about strategy, they were about routine. Coffee, breakfast, familiar faces. He spent more time thinking than acting, reading newspapers instead of ordering moves, playing chess instead of making threats. He wasn't retreating. He was preparing. Because Bumpy understood something Frank never did. Power does not survive chaos, it survives structure. And Harlem in the late 1960s was chaos incarnate. The Black Power movement was rising. Malcolm X had been assassinated just 3 years earlier. Young men no longer wanted quiet protection, they wanted revolution. The Italians were watching closely, calculating their next move. Law enforcement was no longer sloppy, the streets were tightening. Bumpy was walking a razor's edge. Frank, on the other hand, saw opportunity. Where Bumpy saw danger, Frank saw weakness. Where Bumpy saw caution, Frank saw hesitation. Where Bumpy believed in silence, Frank believed in visibility. Frank wanted more, not eventually, but now. And that impatience would define everything that followed. In the months leading up to July 1968, Frank began moving without permission. Small things at first, conversations that didn't include Bumpy, deals that hadn't been cleared, rumors carefully planted in bars and back rooms. He let people believe he was next. He let people think Bumpy was fading. This is how power shifts in the underworld, not with announcements but whispers. The problem was that Frank misunderstood something fundamental. Being close to power is not the same as having it. And Bumpy still had teeth. The breaking point didn't come with violence. It came with embarrassment. At a private meeting meant for real decision-makers, Italians, old-school Harlem figures, men who measured respect in decades, Frank arrived dressed like a headline. Jewelry heavy enough to announce him before he spoke. A coat louder than the room itself. He laughed too hard, talked too much. He wanted to be seen. Bumpy watched him quietly. He didn't correct him publicly. That would have been unnecessary. Instead, he waited, then leaned over and whispered something so quietly that no one else heard it. Frank's smile disappeared. His shoulders dropped. He sat down. The message was unmistakable. You exist here because I allow it. Frank nodded, but inside something hardened. Humiliation is a powerful fuel. By July of 1968, Frank had convinced himself of something dangerous. That history was about to turn. That the old rules no longer applied. That when Bumpy died, the streets would naturally turn to him. He didn't understand that Harlem wasn't waiting for a savior. It was waiting for stability. And Frank Lucas did not represent stability. July 7th, 1968. This is where the legend says everything changed. But the real story is quieter and far more revealing. There was no department store. No dramatic collapse in public. No final words. That morning, Bumpy Johnson went to Wells' restaurant in Harlem, his favorite place. A spot where he was known, respected, and comfortable. He ordered the same thing he always did: scrambled eggs, grits, coffee. Routine. Control. He was surrounded by real friends, men who had stood beside him since the 1930s. men who had bled with him. Among them was Junie Byad, his lifelong enforcer, protector, and confidant. Frank Lucas was not there. Not nearby. Not watching. Not waiting. Bumpy was eating breakfast when pain struck. He clutched his chest. His body gave out. There was no speech, no passing of wisdom, no symbolic moment. Just a man whose heart finally failed. Junie Byad caught him as he collapsed. Junie Byad held him as he died. The man who had walked with Bumpy through decades of violence was the man who held him at the end. Frank Lucas was nowhere in the picture, and that fact alone destroys the entire mythology. When the news spread, Harlem froze. The king was dead. And when a king dies without naming a successor, something far more dangerous than grief appears. A vacuum. The Italians needed a contact. Street soldiers needed leadership. Money needed direction. For a brief moment, everything was unclaimed. And Frank Lucas moved fast. This is the moment Frank had been waiting for, not Bumpy's death itself, but the confusion that followed it. He understood something critical. Truth moves slowly, lies sprint. Before anyone could establish what really happened, Frank started talking. He told people he was there. He said Bumpy died in his arms. He claimed Bumpy's final words were instructions, a blessing. He didn't just insert himself into the story. He hijacked it. And it worked. Because nobody wanted to challenge a dead man's last wishes. Nobody wanted to be seen as disrespecting Bumpy Johnson. And most importantly, nobody had a camera, a recording, or a reason to argue publicly. Frank's lie gave him instant legitimacy. If Bumpy chose him, who could question it? The Italians accepted the story because they needed someone operational. Young hustlers accepted it because legends are easier to follow than truth. And Mayme Johnson. She was burying her husband. Frank mistook silence for surrender. Mayme heard the whispers. She heard Frank telling stories. She heard her husband's name being used as currency. But she was old school. She didn't argue in public. She didn't fight men in the street. She waited. Because she understood something Frank never did. Time is the most dangerous weapon of all. Within months, Frank Lucas began constructing what would become his real achievement, not the drug empire, but the myth. The chinchilla coats, the front row seats, the public appearances. He wasn't just selling heroin. He was selling a narrative, that he was chosen, that he was legitimate, that he was inevitable. And for a while, the world bought it. Because lies don't need to be perfect. They just need to be repeated. But there was one fatal flaw Frank couldn't erase. The people who actually knew Bumpy Johnson, the ones who mattered, did not follow him. They drifted away. They stayed quiet. They watched. And Mayme Johnson remembered everything. Every visit. Every slight. Every time Frank waited in the hallway. Every time Bumpy complained about his loudness, his hunger, his lack of discretion. She knew Frank wasn't a son. He was an opportunist. And she locked that truth away. For 40 years. Frank Lucas would go on to build a real criminal operation. That part is undeniable. He would make money, he would attract attention, he would eventually fall. But his greatest crime was not drugs. It was identity theft. He stole a dead man's reputation, because the dead cannot testify. Or so he thought. Because the truth has a way of surviving. It waits, and when it returns, it doesn't whisper. It cuts. Frank Lucas didn't become powerful overnight. That's another lie. What he became overnight was believable. After Bumpy Johnson's death, Harlem didn't crown a new king. It tolerated a temporary solution. And Frank Lucas understood something that separates successful liars from failed ones. If you repeat a story confidently enough, people will fill in the gaps themselves. Frank never announced himself as the boss. He let others say it first. He corrected no one. He allowed rumors to harden into facts, and when people asked where his authority came from, he gave the same answer every time. Bumpy chose me. That sentence was worth more than any gun. In the months after 1968, Frank moved carefully. Despite what the movies suggest, he didn't take over Harlem in a blaze of violence. He did it with proximity, standing close enough to power that people assumed it belonged to him. He visited the same places Bumpy used to frequent, sat at the same tables, spoke to the same Italians. He dressed the part, mimicked the cadence, adopted the posture of a man he had spent years observing. Frank Lucas didn't invent a new role. He played one, but performance has limits, and the people who had actually built Harlem's underworld could see the seams. The first problem was math. Frank claimed he had been Bumpy's right hand for 15 years. That claim collapses under even casual scrutiny. For 11 of those years, Bumpy Johnson was in federal custody, much of it in Alcatraz. No meetings, no mentoring, no late-night lessons in international logistics. Bumpy wasn't running Harlem from a cell, and Frank wasn't running anything in his absence. Court records show Frank was drifting, arrested multiple times, involved in low-level hustles, never in a position of authority. While real lieutenants managed Bumpy's interests, Frank stayed on the margins. Yet when journalists later asked about those missing years, Frank brushed them aside with confidence. He spoke of learning quietly and handling things behind the scenes. Vagueness is a liar's armor. The second problem was geography. Frank claimed his heroin supply came directly from Southeast Asia, smuggled through military channels during the Vietnam War. The story was cinematic, horrifying, and irresistible. It was also exaggerated. Investigators later found no evidence that Frank controlled such exclusive routes. His supply chains overlapped with others. His operation was real but not revolutionary, not unique, not as vast as he claimed. But by the time facts surfaced, the story had already won. Because Frank understood something critical, the truth arrives late to its own trial. Internally, people noticed inconsistencies. Frank talked too much, spent too loudly, drew attention Bumpy would have avoided at all costs. Old-school figures didn't challenge him publicly. That wasn't their style. Instead, they distanced themselves. They let Frank be Frank. They let him expose himself. And he did. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas had money, real money. But he confused wealth with invincibility. He wanted recognition, visibility, applause. He sat ringside at fights. He wore coats that screamed for attention. He let photographers capture him. In Harlem, that kind of behavior wasn't power. It was an invitation. Bumpy had taught through example, survive by being invisible. Frank rejected that lesson, and law enforcement noticed. When Frank finally fell, it wasn't because he was untouchable. It was because he was. His empire collapsed under pressure that true kings had learned to avoid. Cooperation followed, deals were made, sentences were reduced. Frank survived, and survival once again became a story. After prison, Frank reinvented himself, not as a criminal, but as a narrator of his own legend. He found journalists, found writers, found people willing to listen. And in the year 2000, everything changed. A New York Magazine article titled "The Return of Superfly" introduced Frank Lucas to a new generation. In it, Frank told his story with cinematic detail, Bumpy's chosen son, the genius who outsmarted everyone, the man behind Harlem's golden era. The article didn't challenge him. It believed him. And Hollywood followed belief, not verification. This is where the myth hardened into culture. When Ridley Scott adapted the story into American Gangster, the legend became official. Denzel Washington gave Frank Lucas charisma, restraint, honor. Qualities the real Frank admired and needed. The movie didn't just entertain. It validated. And Frank embraced it. But while the world applauded, the people who knew the truth felt something else. Disgust. Because Frank hadn't just exaggerated. He had stolen valor. He had taken the silence of the dead and used it as proof. And one person watching quietly from Harlem had reached her limit. Mayme Johnson had been patient. But patience has an expiration date. She had watched 40 years of myth-building, watched her husband's complexity reduced to a plot device. watched a driver become a prince. And she decided something. If Frank Lucas wanted history, he was going to get it. Just not his version. She didn't shout him down. She didn't threaten lawsuits. She wrote. She spoke. And when she finally described Frank Lucas's role in her husband's life, she didn't give a speech. She gave 4 words. Words that cut deeper than any accusation. He held the coat. Those words were not an insult. They were a verdict. And once spoken, they could never be taken back. For decades, the myth stood unchallenged. Not because it was true, but because no one with real authority had spoken against it. Frank Lucas understood something most people don't. Silence creates credibility. When no one contradicts a story, it begins to sound like fact, and for 40 years, no one did. Until the one voice Frank never planned for finally broke through. By 2007, Frank Lucas believed he had won. He wasn't just free. He wasn't just rich in stories. He was immortalized. The red carpet in Harlem gleamed under camera flashes. Reporters leaned in. Producers smiled. Frank Lucas rolled through the premiere of American Gangster like a conquering general returning home. This wasn't just a movie. It was confirmation. Denzel Washington, the most respected actor of his generation, had become Frank Lucas on screen. Ridley Scott had turned his life into epic cinema. The world wasn't asking if Frank's story was true anymore. It was quoting it. The film grossed hundreds of millions. It became cultural scripture. Hip-hop embraced it. Jay-Z released a concept album inspired by it. Frank Lucas went from former inmate to folk hero. And while the world applauded, a 93-year-old woman sat in a quiet Harlem apartment, watching her husband's legacy get rewritten in real time. Her name was Mayme Johnson, and she was furious. Mayme wasn't angry because Hollywood took creative liberties. She was angry because they stole truth. She watched the death scene, Bumpy collapsing in a department store, Frank holding him, receiving his blessing. She saw her husband's final moments turned into fiction. She saw Junie Buyyett erased. She saw history replaced with convenience. Frank had counted on one thing above all else. That Mayme would stay silent. He thought she was too old, too tired, too irrelevant, that the noise of a billion-dollar film would drown out one widow's voice. He was wrong. Mayme Johnson was sharp, precise, unafraid. And when she decided to speak, she didn't rant. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't dramatize. She corrected. She wrote a book. She went on the radio. She gave interviews. And when journalists finally asked the question they'd avoided for years, what was Frank Lucas really to Bumpy Johnson? Mayme answered without hesitation. He held the coat. 4 words. That was it. No insults, no theatrics. Just a sentence that detonated 40 years of mythology. In the underworld, those words are devastating. To say a man held the coat means he wasn't part of the conversation. He wasn't trusted. He wasn't respected. He existed to serve, not to decide. Furniture, not leadership. A valet, not a boss. Mayme didn't stop there. She explained. Frank was a driver. If Bumpy was cold, Frank held his coat. If Bumpy was hot, Frank held his coat. He waited outside. He stood in hallways. He opened doors. That was his job. And suddenly, the myth had a crack. She addressed the most famous lie first. Frank Lucas was not with Bumpy when he died. He wasn't even in the restaurant. Bumpy died in Junie Buyyett's arms, the man who had been beside him since the 1930s, not the man who later told the story. She addressed the idea of inheritance. Bumpy didn't name a successor. He didn't believe in heroin the way Frank did. He didn't pass a torch because there was no torch to pass. The organization didn't go to Frank. It went to the people who were already running it. And with that, the foundation of American Gangster collapsed. The reaction was immediate. And it was explosive. Because Mayme Johnson did something powerful. She gave others permission to speak. Men who had lived under the code of silence for decades suddenly felt free to tell their version, not to glorify themselves, but to correct the record. And one voice carried more weight than most. Nicky Barnes. Nicky Barnes, Mr. Untouchable, wasn't a minor figure. He was Frank Lucas's biggest rival, another king of the heroin trade, a man who had nothing to gain by protecting Frank's image. When Barnes heard about the movie, he didn't laugh. He was offended. From witness protection, Barnes wrote his own account, and his verdict matched Mayme's word for word. Frank Lucas was not a boss. He was a talker. Barnes dismissed Frank's stories about coffin smuggling, called them fantasies, called Frank a flim-flam man, a con artist selling himself as history. "We all knew Frank," Barnes said. "Bumpy didn't respect him, he used him, that's it." With that, the legend began to rot from the inside. Historians followed. They checked timelines, compared court records, verified prison sentences, and the numbers didn't match Frank's story. He wasn't present when he claimed to be. He wasn't free when he said he was running things. He wasn't alone in the trade the way he insisted. Frank Lucas's empire existed, but it wasn't singular. It wasn't revolutionary, and it certainly wasn't inherited. The myth had grown larger than the man. The most damaging realization wasn't about drugs or money. It was about theft. Frank Lucas hadn't just exaggerated his role. He had taken a dead man's reputation and used it as armor. He borrowed Bumpy Johnson's silence and filled it with his own voice. And when confronted, he didn't deny it. He deflected. Mayme Johnson passed away in 2009. But she didn't die quietly. She died having done what few people ever manage. She reclaimed truth from myth. She ensured that whenever Frank Lucas's story was told, her words would follow. He held the coat. Frank Lucas lived another decade. He died in 2019. Famous, yes, but forever footnoted. Because now, whenever his name appears, it carries an asterisk. And behind that asterisk stands a woman who refused to let history be stolen. Truth didn't destroy Frank Lucas's legend. Something far more dangerous did. Desire. Because even after Mayme Johnson spoke, even after Nicky Barnes laughed, even after historians poked holes through the timeline, people still chose Frank's version. Not because it was accurate, but because it was perfect. By the late 2000s, America was hungry for a certain kind of story. Not morality tales. Not cautionary warnings. They wanted outlaws with rules. Criminals with codes. Villains who felt like kings. Frank Lucas fit the mold too well to reject. A poor black boy from North Carolina who outsmarted the system. A man who beat racist institutions at their own game. A drug dealer who dressed clean, spoke calmly, and claimed discipline. Reality is messy. Frank's story was. Hollywood understood this instinctively. The truth of organized crime is slow, bureaucratic, ugly. It's paperwork, paranoia, betrayal, and endless compromise. But myths move fast. So the film didn't just dramatize Frank Lucas's life, it streamlined it. They erased rivals. They simplified networks. They turned chaos into chess. And most importantly, they gave Frank a moral arc. A beginning. A rise. A fall. Audiences don't connect with spreadsheets of crime. They connect with heroes who break rules. And Frank leaned into it. He didn't correct the film. He didn't add nuance. He performed. Every interview became a sequel. Every story sharpened. Every exaggeration smoothed into certainty. Frank learned something powerful late in life. If you say a lie long enough, calmly, confidently, it becomes a personality trait. And personalities are harder to argue with than facts. The media helped. Journalists didn't want to debunk him, they wanted access. Frank was charming, he was quotable, he spoke in clean soundbites that fit headlines. He never sounded bitter. He never sounded angry. He sounded reflective. That made him trustworthy, or at least watchable. But beneath the smooth surface was something else. Fear. Because the more Frank talked, the more dangerous his story became, not to the public, but to other criminals. Men who had survived decades, by staying quiet now, saw their world turned into entertainment. Names changed, roles reassigned, power redistributed. And silence began to crack. Former dealers, runners, and middlemen whispered the same thing. Frank was overstating his reach. He had power, yes. Money, yes. Influence, sometimes. But not dominance. Not kingship. He was one of many. Yet the myth crowned him alone. This mattered, because myths don't just reshape the past. They rewrite responsibility. Frank's version framed him as an innovator, a businessman responding to demand. The violence, collateral, the addiction, someone else's problem. But reality wasn't cinematic. Entire neighborhoods collapsed under the weight of heroin. Families disappeared. Generations were erased. And the men who caused it became legends instead of liabilities. The most uncomfortable truth. People preferred Frank Lucas as a myth because it removed guilt. If crime is run by masterminds, then society is just a victim. If drug dealers are kings, then addicts are casualties of fate. It's easier than admitting how many people were complicit. Even law enforcement played along. Some officers enjoyed the myth. It made their careers feel epic, cops versus criminal geniuses. One man to chase. One enemy to defeat. Cleaner than reality. But behind the scenes, the cracks widened. Court records contradicted Frank's claims. Wiretaps placed him elsewhere. Prison logs showed gaps he couldn't explain. And still, none of it mattered publicly. Because Frank Lucas had crossed a threshold few ever do. He became useful. Hollywood used him. Media used him. Music used him. And Frank used them all back. He understood something that escaped his critics. Truth has limits. Stories don't. But myths come with a price. Because once you create a legend, you lose control over it. Others begin to edit it, improve it, exploit it. And soon, Frank's story no longer belonged to him. Young hustlers quoted him without context. Rappers celebrated him without consequences. Internet forums debated his strategy like it was a business seminar. Frank Lucas became a brand. And brands don't care if the founder lied. Yet somewhere beneath the applause, the truth waited. Quiet, unbothered, patient, because lies age faster than facts. And time exposes what memory hides. By the 2010s, a new generation of researchers emerged. They weren't impressed by movies. They weren't loyal to legends. They wanted receipts. And when they pulled court transcripts, police memos, and prison records, the story shifted again. Not dramatically, but decisively. Frank Lucas hadn't invented the heroin trade. He hadn't controlled Harlem alone. He hadn't inherited Bumpy Johnson's empire. He had participated, aggressively, profitably, temporarily. And then he fell. Just like the others. The final irony. Frank Lucas may have lied about his past, but he accidentally told the truth about America. We don't reward honesty. We reward narratives. And the better the story, the less we care who it hurts. By the time Frank died in 2019, the myth had already outlived him. But something had changed. The questions were louder. The skepticism sharper. The applause thinner. The legend still existed, but it was no longer uncontested. And that's when the most important question emerged. If Frank Lucas wasn't the king he claimed to be, then who really was? Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind quieter men. Sometimes it survives by never being famous. And sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones you've never heard of. Frank Lucas wanted the crown. The real kings of Harlem didn't. When historians began peeling back the layers of Frank's story, they noticed something strange. Every time Frank described power, it flowed through him. Money came to him. Decisions came from him. Orders moved outward. But the documents told a different story. They showed networks, not empires, committees, not kings, and power that moved sideways, not down. Harlem wasn't ruled by one man after Bumpy Johnson died. It was ruled by balance. Bumpy understood something Frank never did. Visibility is a liability. Bumpy survived decades not because he was the strongest, but because he was careful. He allowed others to shine. He absorbed pressure. He negotiated instead of conquering. And when he died, that philosophy didn't disappear. It fractured. The streets didn't crown a new king. They divided territory. Numbers men controlled gambling. Italian families controlled import routes. Independent crews controlled distribution. Police pressure controlled everything else. Frank Lucas was one piece of that puzzle. Not the picture. There were men whose names never appeared in movies. Men who never gave interviews. Men who never smiled for cameras. They didn't want validation. They wanted longevity. One of them controlled ports. Another controlled labor unions. Another had judges on speed dial. They didn't sell heroin themselves, they allowed it. And that made them untouchable. Frank's version of history left these men out entirely. Not by accident, by necessity, because acknowledging them would mean admitting something dangerous. That Frank answered to people he couldn't out-talk. The truth was this: Frank Lucas was bold. The real kings were patient. Patience doesn't make good cinema. A man waiting 10 years to make a move doesn't look heroic on screen. But patience keeps you alive. And the men who practiced it outlived everyone. Law enforcement knew this. They weren't fooled by the myth, they tolerated it. As long as attention stayed on Frank expressing bravado, quieter operations continued untouched. Frank became a lightning rod. Fame protected others. And Frank loved the attention. Because attention felt like control. But control is measured by outcomes, not headlines. And when pressure increased, when arrests came, Frank fell hard. The real kings didn't. They adapted. They shifted routes. They changed faces. They disappeared. One investigator later admitted something chilling. Frank made our job easier, he said. He wanted us looking at him. That wasn't strength. That was exposure. After Frank's arrest, Harlem didn't collapse. Heroin didn't disappear. Business continued. Different hands, same flow. That alone tells you everything. The myth insisted Frank was irreplaceable. Reality proved he was convenient. The men who truly shaped Harlem's underworld never needed validation. They understood that history remembers noise, not influence. And they preferred it that way. This explains something crucial. Why no one defended Frank when the myth cracked. Why no powerful figures stepped forward to confirm his stories. Why silence followed Mayme Johnson's words. Because the people who mattered had nothing to gain. And everything to lose. Frank misunderstood legacy. He thought legacy meant being remembered. The real kings thought legacy meant not being blamed. By the time Frank was telling stories, the world he described no longer existed. And the men who built it were ghosts. Their power had already moved elsewhere, into businesses, into politics, into legitimacy. Frank stayed behind. Talking. That's the final irony. The man who wanted to be remembered became a cautionary tale. The men who wanted to be forgotten became untouchable. But there's one question left. If Frank Lucas wasn't the heir, if Harlem had no king, if power was invisible, then why did Frank believe his own story so completely? Because lies repeated long enough don't just convince others. They replace memory. In the next part, we'll go somewhere uncomfortable. Inside Frank Lucas's mind. Not to judge him, but to understand why a man rewrites his own past and eventually can't tell where the truth ends. There's a moment in every long con when the liar stops lying to others and starts lying to himself. That moment didn't come early for Frank Lucas. It came late. Very late. By the time Frank Lucas was giving interviews in his 70s and 80s, he wasn't improvising anymore. He was remembering a version of himself that only existed because he had repeated it so often. Psychologists have a term for this: narrative replacement, when the brain edits the past to protect identity. And Frank needed protection, because the truth, stripped of myth, was smaller. Not weak, but ordinary. A man who rose fast, made money, got caught, lost everything. That story didn't justify the pain, the prison time, or the damage left behind. So the mind filled in the gaps. Frank had spent decades being underestimated. Poor, Southern, black, quiet. Men like that don't get celebrated. They survive by being useful. And Frank learned early that usefulness wasn't enough. You had to be unforgettable. Bumpy Johnson gave him proximity. But proximity isn't power. And that gap haunted Frank. When Bumpy died, Frank didn't inherit an empire. He inherited absence. And absence is dangerous, because when no one fills a void, someone eventually claims it. Frank didn't just step into the story. He rewrote it. At first, the lies were small. I was closer than I was. I knew more than I did. I decided things others decided. Those lies made him feel whole. Then came reinforcement. People listened. People nodded. People repeated his words. That's when memory begins to shift. Neuroscience shows that memory isn't stored like video. It's reconstructed each time you recall it, meaning every retelling rewrites the file. Frank wasn't just exaggerating. He was editing. And the edits stacked. Each interview polished the character. Each book sharpened the arc. Each movie validated the revision, until the myth felt truer than the facts. That's why Frank never corrected inaccuracies. To him, they weren't inaccuracies. They were confirmations. This explains his calm demeanor. People mistake confidence for truth. But confidence often comes from familiarity, not accuracy. Frank had rehearsed his version thousands of times. The truth felt unfamiliar. There's another layer most people miss: shame. Frank carried it quietly. Not for the drugs, but for his position. For being close to power without owning it. For watching decisions happen instead of making them. That kind of shame doesn't disappear. It transforms. Frank transformed it into dominance. In his story, he was never waiting. He was choosing. And here's the most unsettling part. Frank didn't just mythologize himself. He protected others by doing so. By claiming more power than he had, he pulled attention away from quieter men. Men who preferred it that way. In that sense, the myth wasn't just ego. It was insurance. That's why no one publicly crushed his story while he was alive. Because letting Frank talk was safer than correcting him. But psychology has limits. And near the end of his life, something changed. Friends noticed it. The stories became more rigid. Details locked in place. Any challenge was met with irritation. That's not confidence. That's fragility. When identity fuses with narrative, contradiction feels like attack. Frank wasn't defending facts. He was defending himself. This is why Mayme Johnson's words cut so deeply. He held the coat. Those 4 words didn't just question history. They questioned identity. They shrank Frank back to a role he had spent a lifetime escaping. And Frank never responded directly. Not because he couldn't. Because responding would require revisiting the original wound. In psychology, there's a final stage. Myth maintenance. When a person continues a false narrative, even when it no longer benefits them. Not for profit. Not for reputation. But because letting it go would mean starting over emotionally at the end of life. Frank chose the myth. And in doing so, he revealed something universal. We don't remember our lives as they happened. We remember them as we needed them to be. So when Frank Lucas died in 2019, two men died with him. The historical one and the legendary one. Only one survives. And it's not the one that's true. In the final part, we'll confront the last question. What do we do with legends once we know their lies? Do we erase them? Or do we learn from why they existed? Legends feel harmless. They entertain us. They inspire movies, music, quotes. But legends have consequences. And when those legends are built on crime, the cost is paid by people whose names never make it into the story. Frank Lucas didn't just become famous. He became aspirational. Not openly, but subtly. The tailored suits. The calm intelligence. The idea that discipline turns crime into business. That image spread far beyond Harlem. And it mattered, because myths don't stay in the past. They move forward. They shape how new generations interpret power. Young men watching American Gangster didn't see addiction. They saw control. They didn't see broken families. They saw dominance. They didn't see prisons. They saw prestige. This is how damage multiplies. Not through drugs alone, but through meaning. When crime is framed as strategy instead of destruction, it stops being a warning. It becomes a template. Frank Lucas never asked to be a role model. But once the myth existed, intention no longer mattered. The people erased by the legend paid the price. The addicts who overdosed quietly. The families who never recovered. The neighborhoods that lost decades of stability. Their stories weren't cinematic, so they were omitted. Hollywood doesn't like consequences. It likes arcs. Rise, fall, redemption, or at least reflection. But real crime doesn't resolve neatly. It lingers, and the myth allowed society to outsource blame. If a genius criminal caused all this damage, then the system itself wasn't broken. Just outplayed. That lie is comforting. The truth is harder. Crime flourishes where opportunity collapses, where institutions fail, where survival becomes negotiation. Frank Lucas wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom. But myths turn symptoms into celebrities, and celebrities distract from causes. This isn't unique to Frank. Every era creates its outlaw icons, because they allow us to admire rebellion without confronting repair. The most dangerous effect of myth is desensitization. When repeated enough, crime loses its weight. It becomes aesthetic, background noise, entertainment, even language changes. Dealers become bosses. Murders become moves. Victims become statistics. That's not storytelling. That's erosion. Frank's legend also distorted justice. It framed law enforcement as villains and criminals as innovators. Sometimes that's deserved. Often it's simplified. Reality lives in the uncomfortable middle. And then there's memory. What we choose to remember becomes what we choose to value. And what we value shapes policy, culture, and behavior. By elevating criminals, we quietly devalue accountability. We teach that impact matters less than charisma. That confidence can outweigh consequence. Frank Lucas didn't create this dynamic, but his story benefited from it. The saddest part, the real lessons were more powerful. That crime has diminishing returns. That power attracts pressure. That survival often means invisibility. But those lessons don't sell tickets. So the myth survived, even after being challenged, even after being disproven, because dismantling it would require confronting something uncomfortable. That we helped build it. Every interview watched, every quote shared, every legend repeated without context. We participated. And that leads to the final question. What happens after the myth cracks? Some argue we should erase figures like Frank Lucas from culture. But erasure doesn't educate. It just hides mistakes. Others argue we should celebrate them as flawed anti-heroes. But celebration without context is endorsement. The answer lies somewhere harder. Reframing. We don't need to destroy legends. We need to demystify them. Strip away glamour. Restore consequence. Center the forgotten. Frank Lucas's story shouldn't be about brilliance. It should be about cost. Not his rise, but his impact. Not his confidence, but his damage. Because the real heroes aren't the men who profited. They're the ones who survived what profit destroyed. In the final chapter, we'll close the circle. We'll look at Frank Lucas not as a villain or hero, but as a mirror, reflecting what society chooses to glorify and what it chooses to forget. When Frank Lucas died in 2019, there were no street wars, no tributes from Harlem's power brokers, no shutdowns, no sudden void. The world didn't pause, and that silence said more than any headline. Death usually clarifies legacy. In Frank's case, it complicated it. Because once he was gone, the story no longer had a narrator. And stories without narrators become contested territory. Immediately, two versions of Frank Lucas existed side by side. One, the cinematic icon. The other, the historical participant. Neither disappeared. They coexisted. And that coexistence exposed a deeper issue. Who gets to decide what history remembers? For decades, Frank had spoken louder than records. But now the records spoke back. Court transcripts resurfaced. Journalists revisited timelines. Researchers challenged claims once left untouched. Not aggressively, methodically. The tone changed. Articles stopped calling him kingpin and started calling him dealer. Subtle shift. Massive implication. The myth didn't collapse. It shrunk, and shrinking is often more threatening than destruction. Because it forces comparison. New documentaries emerged. Not dramatized. Corrective. They didn't deny Frank existed. They contextualized him. Placed him among peers instead of above them. That mattered. But cultural memory is stubborn. People don't abandon stories easily, especially ones tied to emotion. For many, Frank Lucas wasn't just a criminal. He was a symbol of defiance, of intelligence, of beating the odds. Those meanings don't vanish just because facts change. This is why myth survives correction. Facts appeal to logic. Myths appeal to identity. The internet accelerated this tension. Forums argued. YouTube dissected. Comment sections divided. Some demanded truth. Others defended legend. And many didn't care which was right, as long as the story remained powerful. That's when something interesting happened. Frank Lucas stopped being the focus. The process of myth-making did. People began asking, why did we believe this? Who benefited? Who was erased? Those questions mattered more than the answers. Historians reframed Frank not as an anomaly, but as a case study. A demonstration of how proximity becomes authority. How repetition becomes reality. How silence allows distortion. In classrooms and research papers, Frank Lucas is no longer taught as a mastermind. He's taught as a narrator, a man who understood the value of story. And that may be his most accurate legacy. Meanwhile, the people Frank overshadowed slowly re-entered the conversation. Bumpy Johnson regained complexity. Not saint, not villain, human. Mayme Johnson's words gained weight. Not because they were dramatic, but because they endured. He held the coat, is now cited as often as Frank's grandest claims. That's balance. Even Hollywood began to adjust. New crime stories became less celebratory, more fractured, less heroic. It's subtle, But its movement. Frank Lucas didn't disappear. He was absorbed into a broader, more honest narrative. And this is how memory changes. Not with a purge, but with pressure. Truth rarely replaces myth. It crowds it, forces it to share space. And over time, the louder story loses volume. The final irony. Frank Lucas wanted to be remembered forever. And he will be. Just not in the way he imagined. Because now his name triggers skepticism. Not all. And skepticism is history's immune system. So where does that leave us? At a crossroads. We can continue consuming legends as entertainment. Or we can interrogate them as mirrors. The myth of Frank Lucas told us what we wanted to believe. The correction tells us who we are. In the final part, we'll close this story completely. Not by judging Frank, but by answering the hardest question of all. Why do we keep needing men like him? Legends are seductive. They offer a shortcut to understanding, a way to package chaos into a story we can digest. Frank Lucas became a legend because he understood the mechanics of storytelling before most people even recognized the stage. The sharp suits, the blue magic brand, the velvet voice, all carefully crafted signals. He didn't just sell heroin. He sold a narrative that he was exceptional, untouchable, and indispensable. But the final chapter of his story isn't about him. It's about what happens when a society elevates image over substance. When Frank Lucas passed away, the first obituaries celebrated the man we thought we knew, the visionary criminal, the American gangster. But the historians, the journalists, and the forgotten witnesses whispered a different truth. He was a player on the board, not the king. The discrepancy reveals something bigger than Frank himself. It shows how power is often granted by perception, not reality. If people believe someone is indispensable, that belief can become a self-fulfilling prophecy until the record is corrected. Mayme Johnson's quiet fury, her patience over decades, became the ultimate instrument of truth. Her simple declaration, "He held the coat," shattered decades of myth. In 4 words, she reoriented the narrative of Harlem. She reminded the world that loyalty and presence do not equal authority, and that history can be hijacked by those bold enough to claim it. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't showmanship, it was justice. The correction of memory itself can be the most enduring power of all. And yet myths persist. Even after Mayme's declaration and the corroboration of figures like Nicky Barnes, a segment of the public still clings to the cinematic version. The allure of a single hero, the idea of a self-made genius who dominates the underworld, is intoxicating. It's easier to cheer for one man than to consider the messy truth. Crime is systemic, communities are impacted, and power is diffuse. This is the final lesson of Frank Lucas. We crave legends because we want to believe in control, even in chaos. We want to believe that someone can beat the odds, rise above the system, and claim absolute authority. Reality rarely offers such clear-cut narratives. Legends do. But for those willing to look closer, the story is richer and infinitely more human. Frank Lucas was Bumpy Johnson, but he was a product of his environment, a hungry young man from North Carolina seeking opportunity in a world that offered him few. His ambition, boldness, and charm propelled him forward. He survived in Harlem's underworld because he understood leverage, networks, and perception. But he never mastered loyalty, wisdom, or legacy in the way Bumpy did. Bumpy Johnson remains the king of Harlem in memory, not because he accumulated wealth or notoriety, but because he earned respect, fear, and strategic foresight. He played the long game. He survived multiple threats, maintained alliances, and never let ego override prudence. His empire wasn't flashy, but it endured in ways Frank's never could. Frank Lucas's rise was spectacular. His story was cinematic, but the enduring lesson isn't his brilliance. It's the consequences of replacing substance with story, of confusing image for influence, and ambition for authority. When we elevate charisma over competence, we distort history and glorify a selective, misleading version of reality. The cultural ramifications go beyond Harlem. Frank Lucas's story reminds us that society repeatedly lionizes the wrong figures. Whether in politics, business, or crime, the most visible are not always the most competent, moral, or impactful. The myth is easier, the story cleaner, and the narrative more profitable. But myths leave casualties. The people, the neighborhoods, the communities who lived the consequences of the choices these figures made. Ultimately, Frank Lucas is a cautionary tale, not about drugs, not about crime, but about power, perception, and legacy. Legends can inspire, but they can also deceive. They shape our values, teach our children, and influence how we define success. And unless we interrogate them, they continue to shape the world long after the protagonist is gone. Mayme Johnson's courage teaches the final, unflinching truth. History belongs not to the loudest, but to the patient, observant, and truthful. Her voice, quiet but resolute, rewrote a narrative that had been hijacked by ego and ambition. She proved that authority isn't claimed by proximity or posturing, but by integrity, knowledge, and endurance. Her four words, "He held the coat," are now immortal. They are a reminder that behind every legend there are unseen hands, overlooked actors, and silent witnesses. Real power is rarely where the spotlight shines. So the next time American Gangster plays on the screen, remember the truth behind the tale. Frank Lucas was clever, ambitious, and opportunistic. But he was not the heir, not the king, not the master of Harlem. Bumpy Johnson was the strategist, the philosopher, the true ruler. And Mayme Johnson was the guardian of that legacy, the final arbiter of truth. Frank Lucas's story ends with fame, but it is framed by an asterisk. His legend is inseparable from the correction. He will always be remembered, but not uncritically. In the history books of Harlem, in the minds of historians, in the ears of those who listen closely, Frank Lucas is the man who held the coat. And Bumpy Johnson, untouched, unbroken, the king forever. The story is complete, but the lesson endures. Never confuse spectacle for substance, legend for truth, or proximity for power. Because even the most dazzling myth will eventually meet reality. And when it does, it is the patient, observant, and truthful who win.